Hello, welcome. So glad to have you with us. My name is Katie Cannon. I'm the Curator of Education at the DAR Museum. The museum was founded by the Daughters of the American Revolution to further their missions of historic preservation and education. The collection contains objects found in American houses from mostly the 1700s and 1800s. We have a number of virtual events going on, including regular live virtual tours, and you can sign up for all that on our website. Let me introduce our speaker for today. Amanda Hollander holds a doctorate in Victorian and children's literature from UCLA. She has published several articles on children's literature, connected with her dissertation research on the influence of political movements on fin de siècle children's fiction. She also is an opera librettist and writer of speculative fiction. Currently, she's a librettist fellow with the American Opera Project's Composers and the Voice. So welcome, Amanda.
Hi, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to talking about this. So as Katie mentioned, I am trained in children's literature. I did my doctorate in this work, and I'm particularly interested in how political movements intersect with the development of children's literature and the publication of children's literature. What I'm going to do today is start with a brief introduction of some of the history, the printing history of children's books, which starts in the 18th century in English. And then I'm going to move forward and talk a little bit about some of what we were seeing coming out in the late 18th and 19th century in the United States and what was being collected. So I'll talk a little bit too about some of the books that we know are in the DAR Museum collection as well, and then do a brief overview. When I finish that, we'll do Q&A. So if you have any questions for me, I will do my best to answer them to the best of my knowledge, and we can go from there. So if you're not familiar with children's literature, you probably know more than you think you do. One of the things that is most important to know is that we have still a very strong tie to the origins of children's literature, even in contemporary American children's literature. A very simple example is the Newbery Award. The Newbery Award is given every year for an exemplary work of children's fiction published during the past year. And that Newbery Medal is named for John Newbery. John Newbery was a printer in 18th century England, and he was the one who came up with the idea of how to publish children's books for children in a way that was considering the child as a consumer. That's very important because one of the things he recognized is that a lot of the stories that were being published for children, they were morality tales, or often they were religious instruction. So how to behave, how to comport oneself, how to be a good and godly child. And he also realized that maybe that's what was not pulling these children in to reading material. You had, because of the proliferation of materials from the invention of the printing press and from growing rates of literacy, he realized there was a very powerful and perhaps undertapped market with considering the child as a consumer. So he published a short story, and it was called Little Goody Two Shoes. That is considered one of the first children's books published with the child in mind as the reader. So not what must they learn, I will open their brain and I'll dump in a bunch of information, but thinking more of the child as something, a child who has individuality, who needs to be approached as such. And so Little Goody Two Shoes is published, and one of the things that's very fun to note about it is it comes with, and if you buy a copy of Little Goody Two Shoes, you will also get a pincushion if the gift is for a girl, or a little ball if it's for a boy. So the next time you are in the grocery store and you see a child crying and begging their guardian to purchase a cereal box because it has a tiny toy inside, know that you are participating in a 300-year-old tradition, and one that is almost 300 years. Yes, no, over 300 years. A tradition that is well-founded and well-established, and it comes partly from John Newbery. So this type of marketing is something that was very savvy and very early. So John Newbery didn't just publish that. And what I want to do is, for this early part of the talk, I'm going to bring up a few slides that I have so you can see some of what was getting circulated during that time period. So we will talk over here, and here we go. This first image is a little pretty pocketbook intended for the instruction and amusement, that part is important, of little Master Tommy and pretty Miss Polly, with 2 letters from Jack the Giant Killer and also a ball and pin cushion, the use of which will infallibly make Tommy a good boy and Polly a good girl. To which is added a little songbook, being a new attempt to teach children the use of the English alphabet by way of diversion. And then you can see the printing information below. This is again John Newbery. This comes out in London. It also gets published in the United States. A lot of these works, some were shipped over. We do have the founding of printing presses in Boston and obviously quite famously in Philadelphia. And we'll get to Dr. Franklin in a moment. But here I want to note that one thing is instruction and amusement are now being placed side by side. There is an understanding that for the child to actually process this information, there needs to be some sort of fun incentive, that it's not just dry information and rote memorization, but there is better result if one can engage the child in a way that is fun and is amusing. So this comes out in 1767. So that's when we're starting to see more of these types of books where there is an interest in how do you both instruct the child, but also entertain the child. So we begin to see this kind of transition. And we see that here in a particularly American publication. This is a New England primer, improved for more easily, the New England primer improved for more easy attaining the true reading of English. I still can't quite parse that sentence, the grammar there, to which is added the Assembly of Divines and Mr. Cotton's Catechism. And that's published in Boston. So I just want to note that the publication of these works is starting to move in a couple different cities. In the United States, printing is valued, having written and materials is valued, and not just for adults. I have a couple excerpts from this primer. If you look over to the right, there is very encouraging, Job feels the rod, yet blesses God. Some of these are a little bit intense, but often they're very biblical. And so we have proud chorus troop was swallowed up. I think that is in theory supposed to rhyme, but the way I pronounce these words, it won't. Lot fled to Zoar, saw fiery shower on Sodom pour. There you go. So we have an alphabet, and it's done in a way that is combining that with Christian didacticism. If you don't have any familiarity with that term, didacticism means with the point of teaching a lesson. So a fable, for example, like Aesop's fables, they're didactic. Here is the story and here's the lesson that you're supposed to derive from this. So the idea that they're going to be encouraging these children in very specifically Christian doctrine is happening here. Now, I want to note that this is not invested so much in children's entertainment, unlike what we're about to see next. So in the United States, we're seeing some books which follow more of the Newbery model and some which don't. This is an example of one that does not as much. This is meant to educate the child in a way that is serious and not frivolous. So we also have Spiritual Milk for American Babies, drawn out of the breasts of both testaments, which is fascinating imagery, for their soul's nourishment by John Cotton. So here we have this, and here we have this continuation of the idea of this is what will nourish them more than anything else, is a godly education that is established from a very young age. Now, I want to contrast that a bit with what we have next. So this is The Art of Making Money Plenty in Every Man's Pocket. It's very American, by Dr. Franklin. So Dr. Benjamin Franklin had previously published Poor Richard's Almanac. And there were lessons in there, including on saving money and being able to establish oneself in the world of business. There's some information to that effect. So this was an adaptation of Franklin. So first of all, we have the credibility of it being Benjamin Franklin and of that fame, but also this is, and notice this is from 1817. So this is coming a bit later. Benjamin Franklin obviously still has a certain kind of cultural cachet. He does to this day, more so probably in 1817 to a degree. But what happens is this gets printed, and notice that this is printed in London. So it's published in America. It's also published in London. We're seeing more of the children's book moving in a transatlantic way. And here is an excerpt. It's 2 pages from this particular book. So what they're doing is, again, how you use instruction and combining it with diversion. So the way they're doing that is through pictograms. So we have the at this time. So you see father time floating across the page. When, so W and hen. So when, I guess, is the way one would aspirate that. The general complaint, I'm just going to read through the rest now and you can look at the images. At this time when the general complaint is that money is so scarce, it must be an act of kindness to inform the moneyless how they can, and we're on the next page, reinforce their pockets. I will acquaint you with the true secret of money catching, the certain way to fill empty purses. And then it goes on to the next page. If you were wondering what that bizarre object is on the top right of your screen, if you're seeing it hopefully the same way I am and not a mirror image, the string with the two objects hanging from it, those are pockets. And we can talk a bit more about how that works in terms of 18th century dress later. But this is the combination. If someone were criticizing this, they would probably note that as this edition goes on, they use these in inconsistent ways. Sometimes it's the pronunciation of the word. Sometimes it's being combined with other letters, so it's more complicated, but it does allow children to puzzle through. What I want to note, though, is that even later in the 19th century, we get other books that are very interested in money and in marketing, and they are for children. Here is another one. This is from later in the 19th century. The New York Cries in rhyme. And this is an 1837 edition, and it's a fascinating moment where it takes children into the world of New York's streets. So if they're not already in them as a person moving through them, it's actually taking the cries of different merchants that are, toting their wares throughout the city, moving throughout the city. It's introducing children to a different type of urban environment, the idea that the urban environment is inherently tied to commerce, and the children are learning about this. So rhyme and how that relates to an economic system in which these children are expected to grow up and participate, whether voluntarily or, since we're looking at 1837, involuntarily, right? This is definitely a time period when this is not necessarily an option. So anyway, but this is from New York City. And if you look at the second image here, mats. And so here is the cry from the New York City street you would have heard apparently around the 1830s for those who are selling mats. Here's excellent mats made of oakum all o'er, so nice and so proper to keep a clean floor. And so again, too, I want to note that the keep a clean floor is important because we're starting to see in the 19th century a lot more conversations around hygiene. And hygiene in the 19th century at this time may not exactly match our picture of it now. A lot more of the things we think of, such as hand washing, are going to come in about 20 years later, which they're, by the way, going to be disregarded too. It's considered something effeminate and ridiculous. And why would one wash one's hands? Indeed, as I sit here from my home where I am not able to go outside without a mask, one wonders. So anyway, I want to just note that when we look at these children's editions like these, we see a lot more block prints. It's now understood that children don't want to just look at pages. And we saw that too with the primer, right? The block prints of the biblical texts, but we're also seeing it here. These are the characters of New York City. And there's also a note at the bottom. And I want to pay attention to this too. One's pity would be raised to see this poor old blind man. So that's the man with the mats, who's with the younger child by his side, led along the streets of New York by his little dutiful son. The manner of their carrying their mats adds a good deal to the interest of the scene. They string some on their backs while others hang on before, thus appearing almost covered up with their commodity, and silently but very forcibly appealing to the humane feelings of the citizens to buy their rugs. No honest business is to be despised by its being humble, nor should any person be shunned or neglected because he is poor. Worth makes the man, and industry leads to plenty. Want looks into a diligent man's door, but dares not enter. So when I talk about didacticism, where there is some sense of, if you're going to be teaching moral truths, you often want it to be entertaining. Here, the entertaining part is the image and the rhyme. But then when we get to the actual content below, I want to point out some of what is being very much directed to the American child to notice. Here's some of the terms that jump out. One's pity, dutiful. We talk about the almost covered up, appealing to humane feelings, honest business, humble, diligence. So diligent, if I'm being very specific. We're getting a vocabulary now that we expect a child from the mid-19th century, early to mid-19th century, to be able to understand. It involves ideas of charity, the idea of to whom one directs pity. In this case, it would be the disabled. And this phrasing is really important. You might have seen it a lot if you've ever read A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, the ways in which Tiny Tim is described. In that case, of course, it is the child who is the one who needs the recipient of pity, and the child is the one who is disabled. And I want to note a key thing here. We see a transition where there is less and less pity that the story is willing to extend to an adult in this situation, and more to which it's extended to a child. But what's interesting is Christmas Carol is, although marketed to children now, it was by and large a story for adults and consumed by adults, though shared with children. In this case, we're looking at something that is more directed toward the child reader. And at the same time, it is early on creating this sense of, if you see a blind man working, you must pity him, you must be humane, and note that he is in fact humble. But we also get that strong thing, industry leads to plenty. And this is going to be very important when we consider the late 19th century, when we start seeing in children's literature questions about, is someone pulling their weight? Are they actually doing something that is worthy? Are they contributing in a utilitarian, recognizable manner, or are they acting as a drain? And this is important because we see an enormous surge of eugenic thought in children's literature by the very end of the 19th century. So when I was introduced, it was mentioned I study fin de siècle literature, and that's been a particular interest of mine. And why I want to bring this up is it shows how there is an evolution of this idea of the child as someone who will participate in a commercial capitalist culture, and is going to be expected to have this kind of knowledge. The previous slides that I showed you that had Dr. Franklin's work there, that was considered incredibly important, and it proliferated in households across the United States. I'm just going to move forward now didn't move forward at all. That was interesting. We are not moving forward. All right, I'm going to skip out of that then and stop the share there. So anyway, when we look at these types of books, they're actually setting up a very specific, very strong cultural idea of what the American child needs to know. So again, I want to stress that we have the religious texts, we have, the American, spiritual milk. We also have more and more emergence of the nonsense literature, but that's going to be in the latter half of the 19th century, when there is more of an emphasis placed on the entertainment of the child, the diversion of the child. But we're not seeing that as much in these earlier texts. And certainly there is a strong sense of the child is there to be educated in a specific way that is not always inclusive of their own interests. As this actually goes on in the late 19th century, especially as we start to see a more emerging middle class that has a certain bourgeois interest in educating the child especially with the emergence of color illustrations, when we start to see those instead of the block prints, we see actually that the texts start to shift. But one thing I do want to jump back and mention is that throughout this entire time, even as we're seeing a lot of language of religion and industry, we're also seeing a lot of poetry. One of the most interesting things about the DAR Museum collection, they have a whole series of books that they have from these American households, which is wonderful and very fortunate. But they have many collections of juvenile poetry. And they also have several books of, nursery rhymes, children's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson. And these books date throughout the 19th century. But what's really important is how many of them there are. So first I want you to think, do you know any 19th century poems? This would work better if I were in a room with actual people. Humor me at home, if you will. You do probably know one very famous poem from It's either 1804 or 1806, and I'm going to go with 1806. And it's by a woman named Jane Taylor. It starts, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky." Now, I want to bring this up because I think often if you ask someone if they know an early 19th century poem, the immediate understandable knee-jerk reaction is no. And at the same time, poems like this are very important. They are simple in language, they have clear metrical form, and they rhyme, which means that they are naturally easier to memorize, right? This is a mathematical structure at work within the language. And so this is, of course, obviously very important to me as an opera librettist, someone who writes for music. When you have that kind of structure built into the language, it enables not only the child to easily memorize it, but also to replicate it. And something that's interesting about which books have survived in the DAR Museum collection is that so many of them are poetry. And that just doesn't tell us what a child might enjoy reading. It tells us what they held on to into their adulthood. Most of these religious texts we don't have overall as many copies of. And, I'm sure someone out there will come to claim otherwise, maybe later in YouTube in the comments. But generally, if we see the texts that people treasured, the people that people pass down to their children, they're often fiction and poetry. That's not to say that the nonfiction is unimportant. It's not. It's that what holds the greatest emotional power is actually coming often from these other texts. The "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" is probably the most famous example. I also want to point out they have a very long ability to survive for a specific reason. Morals, ideas about manners, they're actually very shifting from generation to generation. Some of them remain fairly steady, but a lot of the details around them can start to disappear with time. Certainly, if you ask someone now about who holds open a door for who follows them, it won't necessarily follow the same gendered rules we might have heard even 10, 15, or 40 years ago. It keeps changing how we think about who is going to actually be able to be involved with, taking action, who is supposed to be looking out for whom. But the poetry is going to maintain itself unless it contains some, kind of horrifying stereotypes, which some of it does, or it is going to be content that's considered very dated. Sometimes the language or the rhymes is a bit archaic. They have a harder time holding on. Anything simple that's easy to set to music will sustain itself. I did see that someone mentioned in the Q&A is the defense of Fort McHenry, excuse me. I should know that. I grew up in DC, Fort McHenry, and that becomes, of course, the Star-Spangled Banner. So that just reinforces the importance of being able to take a text and set it to a tune. Yankee Doodle Dandy is a great one for going back to our 18th century texts. Another thing that I want to note here, though, is that of the poems that survive, one of the things, too, is that often the ones that have such staying power are the ones that are easily parodied. So although we have "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, how I wonder what you are," we also see that there's a reward, if you remember that, the familiarity for that, when you get to see the parody of it later in the mid-19th century when Lewis Carroll publishes Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, in which the version presented is "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Bat, how I wonder what you're at." And one of the things that's fascinating about this, too, is that Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and yes, it is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, not Alice in Wonderland, which is the Disneyfication, but it is what we are given and what we will stay with, I suppose. But Lewis Carroll's book actually plays a lot with the idea of how rote memorization may not be as valuable a tool. And he does make fun of these types of poems, but the reason it works is because we know them, we memorize them, there is reward in the joke from that familiarity. So this is part of playing into that type of a tradition. And poetry had a particularly vibrant 19th century American life, even for children. I will note that some of the most popular poets who leaned very hard into a certain extreme type of sentimentality are no longer quite as fashionable as they once were. But that is something that's very remarkable about these children's collections, that they do get passed down from generation to generation. And I want to just briefly for a moment note that that's still true. If you look at picture books that are published in the United States, even now, it's very hard for a new picture book to stay in print, because when someone has a baby, and I'm sure that you have seen this or experienced this, everyone tends to give them the same 5 picture books. It's very hard not to. Often those, right now, the ones you often would see most are Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are, maybe Harold and the Purple Crayon, books like these. We all know them, we've seen them. They end up being replicated in many a nursery. You'll have multiple copies at every library in a particular system. And that's because people want their children to experience joy in the same things that they enjoyed when they were children. So when I mentioned that the poetry is what has been held on to, I think that's really important. It suggests something about our value, what we value as readers, as Americans. And that's really interesting as well. Another point I wanted to make too is that we start seeing a lot more of the kind of fanciful literature coming in, and toward the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, we really see American storytelling start to take off in a new way. That's when we get The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. So right around that transition period, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that's when we start to see a lot of these texts take off. I will note too, though, that one thing is these books can have kind of a two-way interaction, which is I'm focused on, how these books are marketed to the child, but some of these books coming over, for example, from England, this is just a side anecdote I do feel the need to share, which is Little Lord Fauntleroy came over to the United States. It's about a plucky American boy, and he goes to England pretending to be the grandson of this heir, this very wealthy man. And of course, he's so noble and so good, and his virtue is what ultimately ends up with him being rewarded. But he was famous in the 19th century for the descriptions of him. He had long blonde curls and a lovely frilly lace collar. The reason I bring this up is that a lot of women started dressing their sons this way. This did not go over as well in America as it did in England. In fact, it did not go over well at all, because at this point, we're also starting to see, and I want to bring this back up to the earlier section, more stringent ideas of what is a boy's story and what is a girl's story. We start to see less of this is for Mr. Tommy and Miss Polly. I was about to say Miss Tommy and Mr. Polly. Why not these days? But in the actual historical moment, this is considered, the toys are different, but the text is the same. We start seeing texts. This is a boy's adventure novel. This is a girl's story. Little Lord Fauntleroy did not have quite the popularity of Frances Hodgson Burnett's other book, The Secret Garden, or A Little Princess, but Little Lord Fauntleroy did result in one boy in Iowa who'd been forced by his mother to wear these blonde curls and this frilly lace collar. He burned down the family barn. So incensed was he at having to participate in what he saw as a demeaning, less masculine gender performance. So that's interesting too. We have this whole other side of things too, where we're starting to see a much more stringent idea of gender breakdown. The boys' adventure novel, as girls from wealthier families start attending boarding school, we see the girls' boarding school novel take off. And so I want to note that when I'm talking about the 19th century, I keep mentioning the 18th century and also the early 20th century, because they're all in conversation with each other. Although they have maybe historical delineations, we're watching these things fluctuate over a continuum. So as you've been lured in by the promise of the 19th century American child, and I'm providing American children across time. But this is really important too. The idea of also, if the child is a consumer, what does the consumer want? And part of what's driving this too is the idea not just of, oh, girls have different interests, but do they actually have their own interests that may not fall in line with these? So we start to see a lot more of that as well. And I want to note that what's interesting right now, the moment we're in, is how there is much more overt conversation about this, both with toys, with books, but also the idea of what does it mean when we talk about this? Well, in the late 19th century, they had a very specific construct. And one of the other things, though, I want to note about the poems, that also is something that is then easier to hold on to. The poems are not usually always gendered in quite the same way. So I'm going to I'm sorry, I did notice that something came in on the Q&A, and I'll do some more at the end, but I actually like getting to interact with these as some of them come in. And it's when with this change of books looking at gender more, is this when toys also seem to move into genderification? So the idea that toys had gendered audiences. No, I would say actually that the toys were gendered far earlier than the books. Which is quite interesting because both boys and girls, it's a great question though, thank you. But both boys and girls who were buying these things would end up with the same text, but with different toys, right? If you buy it for a boy, like this is that pocketbook edition we were looking at earlier. If you buy it for a boy, he gets a ball as the toy that comes with it. And for a girl, it is a pincushion because she's going to be learning embroidery or sewing. So we're seeing that too. One of the things that's actually really interesting too is certain class assumptions that come with this. And I do want to note something that's very important when we think about literature for the child and literature about the child during this time period, which is that we also have to pay attention to what is not there. And that is actually one of the hardest things to do in a study that values material culture. And that's to say, to remind ourselves that there is a whole rich side of oral storytelling tradition that is happening in communities of color that we're not necessarily going to see. Most of them weren't printed, or if they were until later. I'm guessing some of you may be familiar with the Brer Rabbit stories. Those were recorded by Joel Chandler Harris. He himself was white from Mississippi, I believe. And he recorded, though, and wrote down these stories that were from the community, the African-American community around him. But there were a whole series of other stories being passed down. And one thing that's important to remember about that is stories that are passed through oral transmission are usually made for wider audiences, not necessarily adults or children, but for both to listen to together. And something that we also want to keep in mind is that that is how fairy tales originally operated. They weren't for children. Fairy tales were for everyone of every age, and they were told to a wide group of people. It was an audience of all different ages. And so anyway, I just want to acknowledge that when we're talking about children's literature and children's storytelling, we're missing a piece of that puzzle. And we have an incredible series of scholars, African-American scholars, or even writers. Zora Neale Hurston did a great job. I'm sorry, that's not very condescending, great job. She did an incredible, what I admire the work of taking down all of these stories and compiling them. That's very arduous to do. If you've met anybody who goes and collects oral stories or collects music from rural areas or regions that are very remote, it's hard work. But we want to acknowledge how those are still present and out there. So I'm going to be talking about material culture. That is what I studied. But there are things that I'm not covering that are important when we think about what a 19th century child heard in terms of storytelling. So I'm going to move right back now to, we talked about Fauntleroy and the burning down of the family barn. But one more thing I want to discuss while I can is how we start seeing the idea of morality play into these texts in a more convoluted and complicated way, which is to say that during the late 19th century, we start seeing more stories about the bootstraps. Now, what I want to argue is that we have fiction stories that prioritize that suggest if you are good, if you are noble, and if you do things well and industriously, and we see that term show up again and again, industry, then you will be able to succeed. And this is constantly feeding into what we call the bootstraps narrative, right? And one thing that's very important to know about that is it was popularized by a man named Horatio Alger Jr. He wrote several books, one of the most famous of which is called Ragged Dick. Dick is a boy named Richard. He is ragged for he is poor, but he is industrious. I know that the title may sound very different than the content, but it's about a scrappy young New Yorker boy who has luck. He is industrious, he is good, but most of all, he is lucky and ends up being well connected. And it turns out that nepotism can be the greatest gift of all. That being said, it's really important, and I feel like I have phrased this, it's very important. Everything is important to me. But we do see a lot more of a melding of the morality tale with an idea of what this looks like for an urban child. So a lot of what we see with the kind of idea of a child in more of an agricultural or domestic setting is moving by the mid-19th century. We're more thinking about children as engaging with and moving through an urban environment, not just the child with his grandfather in the New York Cries book, but also these children who are negotiating, working as bootblacks, or who are working in the garment industry later in the early 20th century, because children were workers. And I think that's something that's easy to forget, because a lot of the children consuming these books were not. But the children who frequent these books, who are able to have these adventures because they are not being carefully monitored by parents, they have to go out into the world and help support the family. So who is featured in the books and who is reading the books can often be a very different group. One of the things that comes up a lot when we think about industry is that this is also the time when they're starting to think about what rights the child has to education. What does it mean that these children are not in school, that they are in fact working in these factories, whether that's at Lowell Mills, whether that's sometimes in these places in New York, in sweatshops. What does that actually mean? Who is the child and what rights does the child have? And what's exciting to see is how that starts moving its way through children's literature. And just to give you an idea, though, of how negligent society was as a whole at this time, there was in the late 19th century a case where a lot of neighbors knew that this young girl was being very badly abused, and a woman who was I believe she was a missionary, but she was doing door-to-door work, had heard about this, and she tried to get the state to intervene. This was in New York City, and nothing could be done. So they suggested, well, there are rights organizations that work on behalf of children. So she went to them, but they were working specifically on children, for the rights of children who worked in factories. That's not a bad thing that they wouldn't represent this child or her case. It was actually important that they kept their focus on the one goal they were working on. But since that was not an option, she finally found one organization that would defend this child. So what is the child? The organization that defended this child legally in court was the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. The ASPCA actually ended up representing this case. And so the reason I bring that up is when we think about the child and we think about children's literature, is the child sometimes even more than an animal? Legally, in one instance, the answer was no. This was the organization that had to go from there. Now, I will note that because of that case and what happened afterward, we ended up with the organization, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. So we do get that evolution, but is the child, so we talk about the child, but we often don't talk about what we mean. Is the child a worker? Is the child something to be cosseted in a domestic setting and protected from the world around them? Is the child a victim of society who is actually a little more than an animal in a legal sense? All of these things are part of this conversation in the late 19th century. What if the child is, we think of them as this human, but not an adult? What does that mean? What rights do they have? What protections do we need to afford them? So when we think about the American literature for the child, I want to note that it's not one thing or the other. We actually have a series of different children who are all moving through the world in different ways. And we also have a class of consumers, and they're not always matching up with the reality of the American child. And when we consider what is American literature for the child in the 19th century, we always have to keep in mind that it was very fluid and that the idea of the status of the child is constantly shifting and being debated in all of these different forums. And one of the most profound areas this is occurring is in the children's book. So I do want to wrap up now because I know that I have just a couple minutes left, and I actually would love to take any questions that you may have for me. And I want to finish by thinking about a more recent conversation that's been happening in children's literature. And it is revolving around what we think of when we think of the children's poem. So I'm taking this back to the poetry, not just because it is a key part of the DAR Museum collection, but also because a lot of what we see now is imagistic. So like one solid image. Often poetry that we see is free of rhyme and often free of meter when it's published for children. But if you look at what children retain, they retain what has patterns. And so what I want to suggest is that when we think about children's literature, it's very important that we focus on where are we seeing the patterns and what are we missing? These are the questions that consume me when I do my research. and I look at these types of gaps. So what is the literature for the American century child? We don't even necessarily always know who the American century child, 19th century American child is, but that's part of what makes this body of work and this area of research so exciting and important, I think, as we consider who the child is moving through the early part of the 21st century. So especially now as they're all doing online schooling and we are doing online Zoom sessions. So thank you for being here and for hearing me ramble on about these issues and these texts. If you have any questions, I would love to answer them. So I believe the Q&A box is the place to go for those. Oh, and remember when I showed you those pockets that were there? I believe Katie Cannon from the DAR Museum actually has a proper pair of 18th century pockets so you can see what they look like. I would be harder pressed to explain them.
Yes, I'd be happy to. Yes, thank you for tipping me off before we started. Fortunately, I do have a pair that I can show you so that they see they've got a string in between. Here's the pockets. They go on either side of you, so you tie them around your waist, and they're sort of free. They're not attached to your clothes. This is a reproduction pair. I made this pair. We have several originals in the DAR Museum's collection as well. And so I see what you're getting some comments there in the Q&A box. So I will turn it back over to you, Dr. Hollander.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for me? Oh, and thank you. Thank you for everyone who attended. I appreciate you taking time out of your Tuesday to be with me here virtually in Brooklyn. Do I have a favorite children's book and a favorite illustrator? Could I name a star in the sky? I do have several that I'll mention. Some, let's see, from my research, I really love a woman named Evelyn Sharp. So this is my doctoral research, and then I'll talk about some more contemporary examples. Evelyn Sharp wrote a series of fairy tales. She also wrote stories for adults and for some that were for kind of mixed audiences, but she was a remarkable writer. She is most famous actually for a nonfiction book called Rebel Women, excuse me, and those were about suffragettes. She was very influential in the suffragette movement, even though she was not one of the people often front and center displayed. She actually ended up putting together this collection of stories about these women who were doing work on behalf of suffragism, and she was a really remarkable, thoughtful, and compassionate writer. And her stories are actually available on Gutenberg.org. Any links that I mention, I will give to the DAR Museum separately so they can go up through the YouTube page for this chat. And that would be something that I can pass over to her. But some of those stories are there. Other children's books, I do love pretty much anything that Maurice Sendak did. He did Where the Wild Things Are, if you're not familiar with him, which is still a wonderful book. And I will say from Goodnight Moon, my favorite line is still Goodnight Nobody. I loved that. I understand now that other friends of mine actually found that incredibly disturbing and creepy when they were children. So I don't know what that says about me, that I thought it was so magical and wonderful. Journey to the River Sea by Eva Ibbotson, if you're looking for a great middle grade novel, that's historical fiction. Let's see, what are some other ones? Oh, Varian Johnson has some really witty, fun middle grade novels that I think are just fantastic. Those are more contemporary writers. Let's see, oh, from picture books, Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters. Unbelievable, some of the most gorgeous illustrations I've ever seen. And another one, I have sort of a beautiful picture book from Spain that has these very bold colors. And it was from an independent press. I picked it up there years ago, and I really love that. Let me look over here. Rebus, thank you. I am glad you loved my examples. Let's see, how did boys carry books in their pants pockets? For many mother throughout time. Some books were carried in their arms, unsurprisingly. A lot of times they had something, it looks like a belt. It might have even been a belt. We're moving into costume and dress, which is definitely outside my area of expertise, but it would be something like a belt that you would put around the books and like close, so it would hold them tight together, and you could either sling it over your shoulder or, I mean, probably if you're a kid, you're swinging that, which I'm sure could do enormous and exciting damage to your texts. But there also were satchels that folded over and protected those. And I think some of those choices probably would have to do with region as well, what kind of weather those books had to travel through. But I'm not an expert on that, so I would definitely not claim to be the be-all, end-all resource on and carrying. Bootstraps. Well, Dad, yes, I can. Bootstraps. Oh, I'm finding out my connection is unstable with the internet, so let's hope that I hang in there. Bootstraps is the idea that you can pull yourself up through society. It actually is a nonsensical expression because if you pull your bootstraps, your feet can't move, right? You're trying to lift your own foot. It doesn't quite work. But it's the idea or mythology that if you simply work, it's all that you need is hard work and you will move up through society. And what's important about that with the story of Ragged Dick is that's not at all how, even though that was the story that popularized this notion, it was one of them. It was a major contributing one. It doesn't work that way. Dick happens to be in the right place at the right time. He sees a boy who's drowning, he rescues him, and then the grandfather, who's the millionaire in New York City, says, "Oh, you strapping young lad, if you are so good and noble, why are you not taking free courses at the this building downtown where they offer them?" And he's like, "Well, I didn't know that they had free education courses in the evening." And he's like, "Well, why don't you buy new clothes?" "Well, I don't have money, for I am a bootblack." Or is he a newsie? He's a bootblack. He's a bootblack. So he has no resources and there are a few things available, but he doesn't even know about this until some rich man just decides to take a personal interest in him. So it is very arbitrary, and he happened again that in the right place at the right time and lucky enough to save a kid who was rich, and then the family in this book lift him up. But yeah, anytime you hear someone talking about bootstraps, any politician, and it doesn't matter what party they are, all of them use it. What they're talking about is this Alger novel, Ragged Dick. So let's see, what gaps do you see? Oh, I'm sorry, let me scroll up here. Are children's books on the period more accurate now compared to titles written during the period, or less or about the same? It depends on what you mean about accurate. If it means in terms of replicating their environment, they're going to be more accurate often in terms of the language used at that time. Like, for example, if you use historical fiction, one of the most common mistakes I see in historical fiction is that people are talking to, "Oh, the king is coming," and they say, "Oh, the king is here, your majesty. Oh, to be in thy presence." Thy is informal. You do that. You thy, thou, those were the informal. Like, if you speak English or French, the tu form is informal. Vous, you, is the formal. In English, we have kept the formal, and aside from certain prayers in churches, they have pretty much chucked out the thou and thy, but I see that used incorrectly all the time. That's one small example. But accuracy depends. I mean, in terms of costume, it can vary. In terms of a sense of representing a more accurate set of experiences, if you come in with a certain set of biases during a historical time period, you are going to create an exaggeration often or misrepresentation of certain groups. But that doesn't mean that contemporary literature is necessarily more accurate because you are trying to replicate a series of circumstances from which you're removed. So I think it's more about trying to achieve an emotional tenor that's truer to the history of that person or those people. And usually to have more of those stories coming out of the communities themselves rather than having stories told about them. What gaps do, oh, by the way, if you have more clarification on that and you would like me to answer that, I would be happy to, if you add in a question, I would be happy to go back to that. There was, let's see, what gaps do I see, if any, in today's children's literature? It's actually an exciting time to be following children's literature. I see more and more different types of texts, and I think there's going to be a lot more innovation too in how we use new technologies to deliver stories. I do not think they will ever replace physical books. I do want to stress that. I just don't see that happening. And maybe I will be proven wrong within 2 years, and then this will be a charming moment of me looking very foolish. But I don't see that happening. There's something very important and tactile about children being able to handle the books themselves in a way that they can be trusted with something that maybe you don't want to trust them with an iPad unless you have the kind of money where that can be a an easily write-offable loss, but it really enables us to think about where those technologies will come in. I think we're going to see actually one thing I'm really worried about, gaps in children's literature, is publishers. The publishing industry is contracting like crazy right now. I'm actually less worried about all these wonderful writers and illustrators having ideas or having stories than I am about how we're going to get them out into the world. There are only a handful of companies that physically publish these books, and the publishing houses themselves are starting to eat each other up. I mean, at some point it's just going to be like everyone works for, Penguin, Random House, Simon, Schuster's, Harper and Collins. HarperCollins. I mean, it's contracting so wildly. The question is how that's going to impact the publishing industry, but also just getting physical books printed. I mean, I think when I'm going to get some of these details wrong because contemporary publishing on the business side is not my area of expertise, but I do remember when they were printing copies of one very prominent biography, I think it was autobiography, excuse me, they like two of the main places that publish all books were publishing just that because the demand was so high, but it meant it created a backlog for all these others. So there are weird sorts of machinations. We talk about children needing to understand industry. I learned my industry at a young age. The business side of that, actually, that's where I'm seeing some concerning gaps. Are we going to be able to put all these books out into the world? Are we going to get them done in a timely manner and get them into the hands of kids? But I don't know, as long as Dolly Parton has a literature organization where she sends books out to kids, I feel like there's hope in the world. Let's see. Thank you for all the lovely comments. Were early children's books also replicating Bible stories and verses? Some of them did, yeah, more verses, but they did talk about biblical stories. There is one image I didn't have actually in the slideshow. I didn't know if I would have time for it. And it wasn't just biblical stories, it's also stories of martyrs. And usually it had an emphasis of more people who were martyred because they chose Protestantism over Catholicism. So that has its own weighty history in ways I'm sure you can imagine, but especially when you started to see more of an influx of Irish and Italian immigrants in the 19th century, as well as Jewish, but more of the ire, well, not more, a certain part of the ire was focused on demonizing Catholicism, as that was happening in the mid-19th century when they were coming into work in these factories. But yes, there were plenty of biblical verses and stories, but usually they were accompanied by block prints to make them, in theory, more digestible, though they were of enormously varying quality. Okay, cleanliness next to godliness, was unimportant in the 19th century. Oh, I'm sorry, I should have clarified that. It's not that it's unimportant, it's that it is taken to new levels of hysterical extremes in the late 19th century. Weird, like books like The Water Babies come up in the late 19th century, and there's a complete and obsessive fixation on hand washing and on how children need to be clean. Lewis Carroll talked about finding adult women disgusting because they were dirty somehow. So it does have to do also with sexual mores, just to throw that out there. But the federal period, wealthy households often installed plumbing for bathing. I do know a little about this. I know more so about how cleanliness and hygiene are discussed in literature, though. So that is probably why there are some gaps in my knowledge. But thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. What do I think of celebrities writing children's books? Well, I mean, I don't usually find that those books are necessarily universally good. However, I will acknowledge this. The reason they're celebrities are that they usually paid their dues in their own fields before they branched out into another one. These are not people who don't work hard. I sometimes think with annoyance how easy it is for them to slip into getting a picture book deal? Of course I do. But I don't begrudge them that. I mean, these are people who work really hard in the industries in which they specialize, and they achieve success there, and then they're able to use that success to move into other places. So even if they weren't working as hard at writing as maybe I think they're not treating it like a craft, right? This is where we actually think about children's books more commodities. And frankly, here's a really important thing that we don't think about as much. Those books usually sell, and they sell a lot. Most books don't make money. They don't make profit. They lose money in contemporary publishing. You need those bestsellers so that, people like me or other writers I know, often that extra capital from those bestsellers is what provides the extra money when our books, if and when they come out, don't make as much money. I think it's 80% of books that are published lose money. Maybe some break even, and then some break even roughly. But wildly profitable is a much, much tinier number. So they can help the rest of us get published. More power to them. Let's see. Harry Potter took over printing capacity. Oh yes, that did happen historically. But there are even fewer, I believe, book distributor, like that physically bind and make the books. I think there are fewer of those now than there were even when Harry Potter came out. So that's the problem, is the contraction. Again, we're talking about something out of my wheelhouse. So if anyone has more knowledge and I am wrong, feel free in the YouTube comments when this goes up to let me know. Actually, I like learning. So, and I do not know, sadly, everything, though I'm working on it. Were early children's books written for different age groups or levels? Yeah, they were written for really young children, because the idea of when you moved into adulthood was what we would consider a child. So we're talking early teens. A lot of these books were written for the very young. Now, I will note this: childhood for women was a lot longer than it was for girls, as I should say, than was for boys. So like when you look at magazines by the late 19th century that were published for boys versus published for girls, boys, they would be for boys, and the age designations would end at 14. And then you'd see another periodical, and it would be for girls ages 8 to 25. So yeah, that's a lot to think about. But there's definitely a sense of girls are girls with a much further extent into what we would now consider adulthood. I really found that jaw-dropping the first time I read that. But for early children's books, they were written for fairly young children. The idea was once you got like to 13, you were reading adult books. And there wasn't really a young adult category that kind of negotiated that central space. And if you talk to most like preteen children, I think depending on their reading level, a lot of them are reading adult books as well as young adult. It's a combination. But I don't have any children, so I'm just suggesting what I have experienced or seen. Let's see. Were children considered miniature adults? Earlier on, they were. There was the idea that they were. Self-publishing has become much more, that was a very reductive answer. I'm sorry, because I think time-wise, speaking of contraction, there's more answer to that. Children were in some cases considered miniature adults, but by the 18th century, with all the different philosophical ideas and trains of thought that were circulating around, the child was being thought of in a very different way at that point by the end of the 18th century. Self-publishing has become much more respectable. Yes, that is true. Physical books can be printed through print on demand. Yeah, but you have to bear the burden of all that cost if you're self-publishing. If you want those physical copies, you're paying for them. Usually you can't just order one at a time. So if you want to do self-publishing, I think that's wonderful. Do what's right by you. I prefer traditional publishing because I like having an editor. I am not my own best editor. I know this for a fact. Whether it's an academic article or an opera libretto, I benefit from outside eyes and from feedback. But the big thing is cost. If you don't know the mechanisms of this, if you publish a book through a traditional publisher, you are paid typically in advance. That will vary depending on who you are. Yes, again, all freelance editors and proofreaders are available too if you pay for them. The thing is, if you sell a book, you don't pay for those things, the publisher does. The publisher provides the editor, the publisher provides the publication, the publisher in theory will provide the marketing. But I know, okay, well, you work in publishing. I know they're available, but you have to, some people will invest in those too, but I don't know. I think even though self-publishing is more respectable than it used to be, and I do think it's very credible, you have to bear the upfront cost. That has been my experience. But if you have other ideas about that, it would be good to know. I think we are running down Q&A so that we can finish on time at 1. Thank you so much to everyone who stayed around for the question and answers. I'm really grateful that you were here today and able to join me. And I hope that you have wonderful and safe and healthy rest of the week. Thank you.
And let me, on behalf of our whole audience, thank you so much, Dr. Hollander, for this presentation. It was super interesting. We're very honored to have you join us, and hope everyone will take a look at the DAR Museum website for any of our future upcoming lectures like this. This is part of a whole series, and so we do these once a month, and next month we'll have a different speaker on topic.